of tapping into that creative muscle, if I can call it that, from like my past experience. But kind of going further back, it started off contributing to like newsletters, very small newsletters, in like the local community and in like church youth groups. And then eventually I was fortunate enough to study both journalism and also theater. And then, I've always loved information. So I've been quite fortunate to find ways in which to tap into kind of both interests. Yeah.
That is amazing. Like the different routes that everybody has taken is quite interesting to how you end up where you are. Can we put a pin in that for a second? There seems to be like a bit of a technical issue on our side here. I'm not really sure what is going on, but the stream seems to have stopped. For a second, there seems to be like a bit of a technical issue on our side. Yeah. And we're back. Cool. Sorry, guys. We had a little bit of a glitch. And cool. So I just want to go back to your separate journeys and the moments that you realized exactly this is where I am, this is what I want to do, right? Because all of those seem to feed right directly into where each of you guys are right now and the stories that you each tell, right? So, Gabby, you said something along the lines of you struggle between art and journalism. Do you think that do they feed each other? Do you find in your experience, or do you think that there's a vast difference between being an artist and being a journalist?
I think that there's an overlay between the two, right? So if we speak very formally about them, we could say that they do serve different functions in society, right? And what I mean by that is that art, we take a specific topic or a theme, for example, and artists try to make people view the world within a specific lens, right? Or to see things differently. They don't always provide the answers, but they try to provoke us to think about things in a new way. Whereas I think journalism at its heart is really about reporting facts as to what happened. And, we answer the questions who, what, why, where, and when. And essentially, that is the difference between the two. But going forward now, I also think that there's different styles of journalism, right? I mean, if we look at online platforms, we look at like Insta stories, the way I'm going to tell a story there is very different to how I might report something writing for, the Mail and Guardian or the Daily Maverick, for example. So I think both can encompass a theme and a topic that we explore, but we do it in different ways. And then we have something like Politically Aware, where there we try to sift through the noise because there's so much. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly feel sometimes when I'm on Twitter or on Facebook, you literally feel so overwhelmed by the sheer amount of content out there. And what we try to do there is to take a big topic, a big theme, and try to explain it in a way that is entertaining and that is informative, so that we literally just distill what the most important things are. And then we also try to provoke people, to think about things going forward, to reflect on how we live our lives. So there is definitely an overlay, because in terms of writing video content, we're looking at it and we go, okay, I've got to script the story and it's got to have, a beginning, a middle, and an end. If I'm creating jokes for that story, there's a creative side to it. What do the visuals look like? What is the look and feel? So depending on the type of journalism that you're creating for the type of different platforms, there's definitely a crossover. But at the heart of it, they do serve different functions. But I think that collaboratively, there are things that cross over and that are complementary towards each other.
That's awesome. I love the fact that you sort of broke down going into the story and then how you break that down to communicate it as well. Because Politically Aware is quite different to what we used to, like, I think post ZA News world, Politically Aware
Yes.
sort of puts the youth on the front line and goes, now you present the story, now you tell it through your eyes. And what do you guys think, both you and Tyson, what do you guys think that has done for the way that South African youth now interact with the news? Has it?
I mean, I think it creates we're a team of people that work on the content together, but I think it creates a fresh approach, and it takes news out of the old way of seeing it, where you're looking at a broadcast that's at 7 o'clock and you have to, tune in every day. It also adds a bit of humor, not to sort of devalue any of the seriousness or the gravitas as to the situations that we are dealing with. But like I said earlier, there's so much going on in the world. Sometimes it's just a relief to be able to have a laugh here and there.
And also the way in which sometimes you get to unpack a particular angle, maybe which a limited kind of TV news report can't get into, that also kind of becomes like valuable. We also understand, obviously, that people have limited kind of time and data, so the shows aren't necessarily like marathon episodes, but the angle at which you come at a particular topic can become something quite valuable kind of after you've kind of sifted through the noise, as Gabby mentioned earlier. So yeah, so it's quite cool to be part of a collaborative process that contributes to interpreting the news that way.
And also, just touching on Tyson's point, I think to distill it, it's nice to be able to, for example, like looking at our previous episode that we shot about lockdown and police brutality, and kind of just honing in on it and exploring the topic in a way that is succinct, in a way where we try to be as objective as possible, and to just lay out exactly what is happening so people can really have a sound bite, a quick look at it, and then understand the world around us a little, more clearly.
Let's talk about the sound bite sort of headline. I don't want to say that there's the world of the clickbait, sort of like the single headline makes you want to click on it right now and go and get the whole story through it. But then most people live with just that headline and never actually read the story. So how do you, and I'm going to pose this to Riley first, because you operate directly in that world where you're getting engagement and you're getting people to click on the video links and actually interact with the stories that would then be a full article and full magazine. So what is there a structure? Is there a pattern or like a template that you use, or is it story dependent? That's what goes with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question too. And obviously, no, I think the biggest thing, no one wants to be the guy who just makes clickbait. Even if you are working for a company that's like a verified news organization, you don't want to do that. It's just not something you want to be a part of. But I think at the same time, you're also presented with the challenge of making people watch the story in the first place. So what is it, the thumbnail that attracts them? In my case, it's video. So I'll make 1 to 2 to 3 minute videos on a specific news topic that break down sort of a bullet pointed list of the most important aspects to know. And there's a link at the top. You click it if you want to dive deeper. So the thing is, you have to make, if it's text on screen and no one's talking and it's just images and text, you want to make ways sort of like how the video is visually appealing. And I think sort of what Gabriella mentioned, like that's why art and performance sort of cross over well with journalism. If you're skilled in graphic design or art or sort of presenting things well, you're better at attracting viewers to your story in the first place. So first things first is finding that topic. And the next thing is, how do I pull these viewers in the most interesting and engaging way? So it's a constant challenge, and I don't think there's only one way to do it. There are literally thousands of ways you can do it. It depends on what you're talking about, and it depends on who you're talking to. So with me, I'm always looking at why is the story relevant? Why is it relevant now? Who's it relevant to? I'm looking at, okay, I've got the story, I've got the script. How do we make this visually appealing, visually interesting, while also not sort of being, I guess, entertainment, but making this engaging and sort of like, I don't want to use the word thrilling, but exciting to watch, at the end of the day. So that's a constant challenge for every journalist, like no matter where you work, so you might think your story is super interesting, but at the end of the day, like someone else might be like, this is kind of boring, so I gotta appeal to everybody. And that's a constant challenge. And you have to do all that without being clickbait, which is a challenge. So, yeah.
That presents a very interesting challenge in itself. But then it actually leads me to the next question, which is how are stories shaped by the medium of delivery? Like, you said being on video, you decide whether you're using text or is it audio based or is it actual footage, right? So how is the story sort of selected for that? Because I would assume, being like a person my age, if I'm scrolling through the internet, what gets me is text. I'm like, I don't want to click on the sound first. So I want to sort of read that quick and it's text that pops up. And then I'm like, oh, this sounds like something that I might be interested in. Cool, click and watch.
I think I guess like the text on screen stuff is important. I mean, it would kind of go on the route of like, like Now This or like AJ Plus. They kind of do these short videos, especially for like Facebook, not everyone wants to click on the video right away. If they're scrolling, they just kind of want to see it and they want to see the text. And that's a way to sort of get the story to them without making them click on it. And if they want to click on it, they can. But I think for us, it depends on the video. So we have these sort of text on screen newsy videos over here. And then we have sort of our editorial longer format interviews over here, which these can get more creative. That's why we have like creative directors that are above me that sort of dictate the storyboard of the video and the visuals in the background. So it's an entirely different process. And so for me personally, I'm constantly kind of like jumping between this one and this one. But they're both equally challenging. I mean, even though one might be longer format, you still have to make people click on it. So this is the other category too, is they're both equally challenging, I think. So.
Now the important question, which medium reigns best?
That depends who you ask, I think. I mean, for views, I think, sort of the text on screen ones, especially because they're so easy to crank out. You can crank out 2 a day. I can crank out like 2 a day. And, I have 10 by the end of the week, and then that adds views. But these longer ones take like a week to produce. And you might only get on YouTube 2,300 views on our YouTube page, or you might have a video blow up and get 203,000. So sometimes it's hit or miss and things don't go the way you want it to, but at the end of the day, it's storytelling. Storytelling is important. And even if you don't get the views, that story at least it was told and it's out there now for people to consume. So
that leads me to more of the targeted sort of stories. And this is more to you, Tyson and Gabriella. All right. So when it comes to telling the different stories, like Tyson, you use comedy as a tool, right, to get your stories across as well. And when it comes to sort of marrying your comedy and your journalism, is it targeted or is it what you feel is relevant to talk to you at that time? Or is it what is actually relevant based on social media and the outlook?
In terms of like comedy as storytelling and using kind of the journalism background, it's probably deliberate in the sense that having kind of worked in kind of different forms of storytelling, you're thinking about obviously the medium that you're working in, the time frame, and then let's say, for example, if my target is to create maximum 67 second of like skits, you're considering the time frame and then also the different devices that you use to tell the story. So the type of the thought that you put behind the character, and then you don't waste like any words. So you're not just kind of like waffling, but it's quite deliberate from the one line to the next. And it is definitely considered because you're thinking of maybe the platform that the people are initially going to encounter it, which is social media. And then potentially, because the skits are short and maybe less data intensive, the other mediums, like for example, if they get shared to WhatsApp, for example, what does that mean for how I think about the way that I put together like a skit? You know what I mean? So everything is definitely deliberate, having considered the ways in which we consume. And in South Africa specifically, knowing how access to data is such like a huge like hurdle on its own. So you know that like if someone's going to be downloading it off the social media onto their WhatsApp and they're sharing it, then yeah, then that in itself is less like data intensive, but you're still reaching a wider audience who may not have accessed it on the initial platform that you served it in. So yeah, there's a lot of thoughts that goes into the way in which you put something together, and just how deliberate it ends up being. Yeah.
Now that's interesting, because one thing I've always seen is when it comes to WhatsApp stories, right? Those are presented somewhat differently to what you would see on Facebook, right?
Yeah.
Like if you look at a video that's on WhatsApp, you're like, okay, this is South African comedy, or South African videos are different to what you would normally find sort of floating around on Facebook.
Yeah.
So do you find that translating, especially with your comedy, translating that to a wider audience, which would then be on WhatsApp, do you find that that changes fundamentally the way that you frame it?
Yes, in the sense that when you think of even traditional comedy skits tend to be around like from the 2-minute mark, like round about there onwards. And when you're talking about stand-up comedy sets, like, yeah, a short set is around about like 5 minutes, or sometimes someone has like a really good gag which lasts, I don't know, a total of like 90 seconds. But when I'm thinking that, okay, what if people need to be distributing this clip like via Bluetooth even? Let's say they don't even have data. So there's two of us, there's Karabo and Tyson. Karabo has data, Tyson doesn't. So Karabo downloads the clip from Twitter and shares it to me via Bluetooth. The fact that the skits aren't longer than aren't like 2 minutes long also has implications on how much space it takes up on your phone, and also how much data it takes for you to download it. So yeah, there is a like a very strong consideration of who you're speaking to and how they might be accessing it, even if it's via like a third party. And then yeah, it then impacts how you put it out, because you also kind of learn from what other people are doing. So a lot of kind of creatives in lockdown now who are creating video content are doing so in like a longer like format, which then potentially makes it inaccessible if people are going to be literally keeping it and storing it on their phones. So yeah.
Also on that point, just touching on Tyson's point, I think mediums and platforms also sometimes dictate the length of the content that we make, and so do generations. So for example, if I think about TikTok, those videos can only be 1 minute, right? And we have a lot of Gen Zs on TikTok at the moment consuming information there. So you go, cool, how do we create content that also appeals to that market within the confines of that platform? So there really is such a broad variety in terms of like type of content and the platforms that we make and the platforms that we have to put that content on, the different generations, the different target groups that are watching that content. But also I think WhatsApp is a very interesting thing, even from a more hardcore news viewpoint. Like there are publications now which are only being distributed via WhatsApp because they're made for mobile. And I think like considering that we need to think about like people are going to be consuming content on their phones. So how does that influence the way that we make content, even in how we shoot it, right? So traditionally video, we always shoot like landscape because that's what the eye can see. But now we're increasingly shooting things more portrait mode. So there's a lot of interesting things I think for creators to play with and to consider and to experiment with as well.
I mean, it's the changing attention span. I want to say attention span that people have, which is literally a minute. Like you have a minute to catch somebody's attention, or you're done. It's like, how much do you talk? Like, how much do you compress into that very first minute? And where's the hook?
So quickly, I'll speak on in terms of politically aware, right? So we always, in most of our videos, we always have like an opening hook within that short amount of time. But because of most of our content, the long videos are put on YouTube and then they're shared on other media platforms like Facebook or Instagram. I think because of the nature of the content that we are creating, because there are I'm talking about our longer term videos. So we have like a weekly aware, which is kind of like a satirical news update as to what's happened in the week. And we have a longer, more like 8 to 10 minute video, which explains things. I think in the context of the explainer videos, because they're of a high quality and they're informative and entertaining, we can afford to make them a bit longer simply because a shorter amount of time does not give us the luxury to really explain what we need to explain. And if people are engaged with the content, they're likely to stay online because the content is good, both in terms of the production value, but also in terms of the way that we're telling the story.
Yeah, that is really cool. Yeah. I want also, in terms of the way that the story is told, I want to go into, so like today's movement, right, is that the story doesn't necessarily always come from the top down anymore. You know, people aren't waiting for that morning newspaper to know what is going on anymore. Nowadays, you're literally getting the story as you move. With everything that is happening currently, you're getting more from people on the ground than you are from the news sources. So how are you guys in your own different sort of, I don't want to say fields because you guys are in the same field, but in your different capacities, sort of dealing with the way that the news is rolling out right now with everything that's going on regarding Black Lives Matter and the riots that are happening all over the world?
Yeah, I think even before the events of what we're seeing over the past week and a half here, you know, with us, we have a breaking news team and a breaking news journalists sitting in a whole, you know, part of the building and working and constantly updating stories as quick as we can. But for me, it's like if I'm going to make a text on screen video or recapping a series of events, sometimes those events and results and statements can change while I'm making the video. There was a case back in just before Christmas in December, and I was at the office from 9:30 a.m. to 11 p.m. At night and just before midnight, because there was a story I was working on with a video story I was working on with the impeachment case, and the story kept changing. And I had to re-edit the video 9 times and switch out quotes just for a 60-second video. So things can change really fast and you have to adapt, but that's the nature of the job, I guess, you know. So, but for today, you know, I've been following the protests, the speeches via Instagram Live, things like that, TikTok, Twitter, live streaming on YouTube and Periscope and all these apps. And sometimes, you know, you might have CNN on one channel and they may be covering it, but these kids with a cell phone have amazing footage they're getting right now, and it's on Instagram Live, and CNN doesn't have it. So I think, especially if you're a young person looking to get into journalism too, this kind of goes into that. If you have a cell phone, I think it's important to realize how powerful that tool is to do storytelling, especially in moments like this where we have, you know, social justice movements across the country, the movement for justice for George Floyd, reforming America's police departments, and you have all these kids with cell phones who are, if those weren't there in this moment, I'm not sure the movement would be as powerful as it is. So I think that, you know, it's really important to understand that you have the ability to tell these stories with what's in your pocket too. So that might go into another thing you want to talk about later, but I just wanted to mention that as well. So.
Yeah, but that is definitely something I wanted to touch on as the sourcing from people's stories, right? You have people who are on the ground who are in the middle of the protests who are sending out videos and posting them, and people are seeing them there first. And then they sort of getting their story or that version of the story first. Then I want to get into, with so many different versions of the story, how do you sift through all of that to actually find the true story? Because you're hearing the one side, especially right now with what was going on with the looting. You're hearing the one side going, everybody's looting. This is what's going on. It's gotten dangerous. It's gotten bad. And then the other side, the story comes out later and it goes, but that's actually not, it's like a tiny little minority group of people within this protest who are doing this. It's not the main thing that's actually going on. Let's focus on the main story. So how do you then sieve through all of that mess that's sort of coming through your newsfeed to find what's true? That's a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming in the same way that's overwhelming to log onto Facebook in the morning and get bombarded with news clips. So I think that the reason, within regards to looting specifically, the reason people think that it's not a small group of people is because it's played on a loop on 24-hour news networks. And I think that if you get away from that, you can get a better picture of it if you dive into it in sort of a different format. So you might have a different idea of what the story is and what's going on if you're watching it on a 24-hour cable news network versus reading a story, say, in the New York Times or in Forbes. That might give you a more concise, detailed breakdown of what's really going on. But the problem is that entertaining to watch on TV? Yeah, honestly, it is. For a lot of people, it's violence, it's things on fire, it's emotional, and if it's just played on a loop over and over again, but even though it's the same 4 or 5 clips, it might give the viewer the wrong impression that this is what everyone's doing, and that's not the case. So it's really important to dive into it's really important to figure out how do we get out the whole picture in one engaging, concise, either video piece or written piece for us. And that's a challenge that's constantly evolving in every newsroom, I think. So yeah, for us, that's what at least that's what it's like for us up here and everything. So
I think it's also there's a responsibility, Karabo, you touched on earlier, like clickbait, the difference between being, like a clickbait news type of tabloid and something that's more established and more trusted. And that's like a whole other topic on itself. But I think there's a big responsibility for people creating the news to make sure that they are as objective as they can be, so that we stick within our principles of what it is to be a journalist. And then also we need media literacy with our consumers. Like as viewers, we really need to be, because it's so easy, and I'm sure we all do it. It's like it's living in your bubble online. If you're only engaging with 1,000 people in your online community, there's so much more that you're missing out of. And that can, as Riley was saying, it perpetuates the cycle of reinforcing viewpoints or videos or making stories seem more or less than they are. So I think it's also a responsibility on us to be critical about the kinds of things that we are watching and we are consuming. Which also becomes difficult in times where there are a lot of emotions, where there are a lot of protests, where communities are really building against fighting injustice. But there are also organizations like in South Africa, there's Africa Check, and they're an organization which verifies facts, verifies videos. But we need to just all be critical, I think, about what we put out there and what we consume.
Yeah, it's interesting. Because in the same way that, like, if you think of media traditionally and what news values and like a journalism sort of code of working meant, there was always an onus on the journalists to be doing their jobs as far as checking facts and being balanced in your reporting. But now, with this noise that we are constantly bombarded with, that Gabby alluded to earlier, just in terms of like the constant news cycle and then everything that you're seeing online, the onus is still on the journalist, but there's also a responsibility which has kind of been shifted on the consumer or the reader, to just be wary of like those potential kind of pitfalls. But that said, yeah, when you were mentioning kind of the different sides of the story, that I suppose that speaks maybe to just trying to work in like a balanced way as a journalist. But there's a quote, just thinking, the TV show The Wire, there's someone there who was like, I think you need a lot of context to seriously examine anything, which I think is pretty true in the sense that like any form of like news production is going to need like some context, which is essentially like, the different kind of sides of it, if I can call it that, to be able to speak with a bit of nuance. So yeah.
Yeah, when we look at context and we look at sort of echo chambers, right? Right now, I feel as though a lot of the news cycle, like you were saying, Riley, if you're looking at something that's happening on a loop constantly, it builds up the story a lot bigger than it actually is. So it kind of becomes this strange, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in South Africa, we sort of run into, we've got ENCA and we've got sort of SABC News, right? And one side goes into a tiny little echo chamber where you could flip through channels as the news are playing at the same time, and it's literally the same script sort of happening through all those news channels. And then you switch over to ENCA and it's completely different. It's a whole new world in there. So how do you ensure, what is your responsibility as media to ensure that you get more sides of the story so you avoid that sort of echo chamber, you know, just hollowing whatever you believe?
That's a huge challenge, I think, and it's even more so a challenge for cable news networks, I think, too. I'd like to think of, for me personally, like in studying journalism and after I graduated and stuff, I always like think of stories as without sides, I guess, if that makes sense. So I always thought of them as like a square, and you have a piece of paper wrapped around the square, and on each or a cube, sorry, and on each side of the cube, you have one part of the context, another piece of context, and these can be thought of as sides. And I just thought about when you're writing a story or making a video story for news, sort of unwrapping the paper from that, getting rid of the facets and laying it flat on the table so you can see everything clearly. And that to me is what context is. So you're not presenting things as, here's what one side said, here's what the other side said. Here is the context of the story, and here's what people are saying about that story. Here are the facts, here's who's wrong, here's who's correct. And here's some sort of reaction to it. So I think every journalist is sort of constantly figuring out how do I do this better with my medium? Because it's different. The way you do that is different in every medium. It's different if you do it on TikTok. It's different if you do it on Twitter. It's different on CNN. It's different at Forbes. And I think it's with the media landscape now, it's evolving so quickly that sometimes I feel like it can be hard to keep up and change. But especially in an era of fake news and deep fakes, it's constantly challenging. And so journalists, I think now today are so important for us to lay the facts out and put things within the proper context. Context is literally everything, I think, to us. So
I hear that fully, like getting it right and getting the context out. Can you guys tell me what was the favorite piece that you've ever worked on? Is this like the same as asking you to choose the best cat with your children?
Should I go? Okay, I'll go first here. I think, I think my favorite piece ever, if you're making me pick, was a piece I did on, this was back in college, so I guess it was an hour-long documentary on a series of racist incidents that occurred on my college campus. And it ended up resulting in the university taking steps to combat racism on campus. So it had like a concrete change that resulted from the production of the documentary. So I think because it had an effect, that's what makes it so special to me. Like, it was my biggest piece I ever did. It took 8 months to make and edit, and it did something. It had an effect on people. It had an effect on a system. So I think that's why it's special to me. So
I think it's hard to choose a favorite piece, but something that I think had an impact on people was I did a profile on a genderqueer artist who subsequently, after I did that profile, they created a whole body of work and they were in the newspaper because they received a lot of hatred, a lot of trolls, and it wasn't a very nice situation for them. But what I tried to do with my piece was really just try to unpack. At the time, being genderqueer hadn't really hit like mainstream publications yet. People were not speaking about it so openly. So it was really unpacking what that meant. Along with that, we touched on, you know, colonialism and white privilege and how that fitted in the world and how we operate in the world. And the artists, they then told me after that if anyone wanted to understand them more or understand more about their work, they always referred and sent that article to them. And like Riley said, I think the kind of work that you really want to make is work that has an impact on people, that maybe makes them see things differently, maybe makes them judge less and sort of seek to understand things in a new way, or consider things in a different way?
On my side, it's again hard to choose when it comes to politically aware, for example, but the first that comes to mind, or the first couple, are there's a piece that we did on Ingeba, The Wound, the film, which did like really well internationally, but and also like on home soil, but of course because it spoke to something so specific culturally, it was also quite polarizing. And the timing of when that particular episode came out was interesting, also in the voices that came through, because I think one of our colleagues, Steve, went through to like a screening where people pretty much from all kind of sides of the divide or debate kind of said their piece, and you really got a sense of what the film was about, and also why it was so important to people. And then there's also things like the situation at ESCOM. We did like an episode on that like last year, and what it really means for South Africans in the long term. And then also personally, in terms of creative writing, was probably the show that I did, like super personal, using my dark complexion and experiences with what that means with people, thinking I'm not South African, and what that means, in terms of the xenophobic attitudes I encounter, and then having a much broader conversation about what was happening in the country. In fact, what tends to happen in the country here, like from time to time, with the flare-ups of xenophobic violence. So yeah, similarly to what Gabby was saying, and Riley as well, it's the ones that tend to have an impact that stick with you.
Yeah, and it's so important. I think that's the heart of any sort of storytelling, is to have an impact, to make that first something that changes people's lives, or changes the way people think. I think that's the most impactful thing that we could present. Now, you touched on something that I want to like touch on before we get into sort of the future and what we each are working on right now. And that is, South Africa has a very interesting, it's an interesting field to try and influence, or to try and tell a story in, right? Mm-hmm. We have a really terrible literacy rate in the country. And that obviously then changes the way that stories are presented, or the way that people sort of grapple with stories, right? The most popular newspaper in the country is Daily Sun. Technically tabloid, but not really. We don't say it's tabloid, but technically kind of is, right? And that is the most popular one. When you're looking at on the political side, then we're going into sort of Afrikaans newspapers being coming second best to all of those, and then so it's City Press and the ones that we know, that we used to. Is there a place, as what I'm actually trying to get to, as presenting a story to South Africans, a written piece to South Africans, what is the challenge in making sure that it is received and not misinterpreted in any sort of way, shape, or form? Is that the responsibility that lies on you guys, or is that a responsibility that sort of lies on society to make sure that we upscale literacy so it meets journalism? That is a hard question, even as I was asking it.
I think just generally, the first kind of thoughts that come to mind is it depends on how the story is kind of being told, and who the receiver like is. So people may not necessarily be like first language English speakers, or even second language English speakers, but if you gave them, or if you broke down, like, but if they picked up a copy of Isolezwe or Ilanga, I'm actually not sure if Ilanga is more kind of, anyway, but if you gave them like a Zulu language newspaper, let's say I'm a first language Zulu speaker, and I stay abreast of what's happening, current affairs and politically, in terms of, you know, television and radio and other forms that I can find, like new digital forms. If you give me like a copy of, you know, something that is even like my third or my fourth language, I won't necessarily engage with it in the same way that like a first language English speaker necessarily would. But that speaks kind of more necessarily to the accessibility maybe like of, you know, the language than it does to my engagement with like media and content. So it's, again, it's a tricky thing just because of how linguistically diverse we are. But yeah, it depends from person to person, like the ways in which I'm going to consume and receive like certain media. But yeah, now I kind of lost my train of thought. But that's the general kind of point that I wanted to make in a general sense. Yeah.
I believe that when you translate a story, you fundamentally change. Well, not fundamentally, but you change the way it's received. Once you translate it, you change how it's received. And that's a problem that I see in South Africa a lot, is that we translate the stories. We don't necessarily tell them in that language. We translate them from one language to another, and that changes the way it gets received. And this is something I would love to go into a test. If there's anybody out there who wants to sit for the next 2 years writing about how translating stories changes the way it's received in South Africa, yeah. But yeah, I think it's something that would be really interesting to look into. So is there anything that's sort of interesting that you guys are working on right now that you feel is going to affect or is being affected by our current status?
Yeah, next week I'm going to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was killed, and I'm going to be interviewing 3 business owners, 3 Black-owned businesses in Minneapolis, talking about their businesses, how the protests have affected them, how the death of George Floyd affected them, and what they want to see change in the city in terms of, you know, reforming the police department, the city, you know, helping the Black community in Minneapolis and stuff. So I have 3 interviews. It's going to be like a short form documentary style piece coming out. It's probably the biggest piece I've done for Forbes, I think, for myself. So I'm really excited about it. So yeah.
Please send links as soon as it's out.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, it'll be out on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So,
Gabriella?
I'm with Politically Aware. I'm busy working on a story which we're releasing at the end of this month, which is about COVID-19 and the impacts on the arts industry. I think in South Africa, artists always feel like they're not prioritized. We have a minister of sports, arts and culture kind of clumped into one portfolio there. So I'm going to be interviewing a member of parliament and quite a well-known artist, because I think sometimes it's very easy to point fingers at the powers that be, but we might not always understand the policies, the time, the processes that really go into promoting the arts and ensuring that the arts are more self-sustaining in the country. So that's the topic that I'm looking forward to exploring this month.
Yeah. My side, contributing towards like the weekly content that Politically Aware is putting out in between, you know, the bigger episodes, such as the ones that Gabby's working on. Yeah, and also just trying to keep the creative writing muscle going with kind of short skits and playing around with the voice on social media. Yeah.
Please keep the short skits coming. Yeah. These are 2 things. Number one is that with the characters and the skits that you create, is that a way, do you think that the story, or are you using that as a tool for society to sort of look at itself through the eyes of, you know, a foreign, like a foreign reporter, for example, in the case of Bob O'Connor character that you have, and what is the response that you've gotten for
that? In terms of it being like a whole kind of ongoing series, it was an accident. I was just, you know, kind of creating. Initially, it was like just some folks from church wanted me to do like a live, just, you know, camera thing and telling jokes. But I figured I'm probably better at like kind of putting together like a skit. So there was a whole news parody, and the barber character, who's existed for like a while now, he did like a little kind of segment on that. And then when I put that out as a standalone thing and people responded the way that they did, it was an opportunity to, I don't know, I was just asking why did people respond the way that they did? And then, yeah, it's because he's a quirky sort of outsider and observing things that are distinctly South African, but also distinctly township, if I can call it that, because I'm based in the township at the moment. So yeah, it was just a response to like, why is it working and what are people connecting with? And yeah, because, you know, characterization and voices are things that I've been playing around for a few years with now. It's been interesting, very interesting.
That is amazing. I can't wait to see more of what's coming up. I saw the box skit. I was like, I'm waiting to find out what the box is all about. So I am really excited for more. I mean, there will be like all the links to your guys' stuff is going to be at the bottom here. So guys, please click and check it out. And Gabby, I am really, really 100% interested in what is going to happen with the arts in COVID. What have you found so far? Because
So I mean, you were touching on earlier, like how do journalists keep tracking their stories, right? So for the past while, I've known that I was going to be creating this piece of content. So I've kind of just been tracking it. And like every time I come up, like if there's anything interesting on Twitter, I kind of screen grab it or just save it on a doc, or I put it on the greater politically aware Trello board where we can all follow all of the stories. I don't think there's any easy answers, and I think there are systemic issues at play. But I do think a lot of people have been comparing, for example, South Africa to Germany, and they'll say, oh, well, they had, I can't remember the exact figure, but they had like this whole grant given to all artists and they would be fine. And here we've had problems with like email addresses and workflow and DMing, you know, Minister Nati and Tuetwa. I don't think we can really make a comparison because we are in a completely different context, but I'm interested to hear what people's solutions are. So how do we make the industry more sustainable? Because we're always, whenever one of South African artists do really well, everyone is really quick to laud them, to celebrate them, as we should. But what happens between that stage? You know, what happens when we're not being celebrated in that way? Also, just because I think arts and culture and heritage in general, we have such a rich and diverse arts and culture scene in South Africa. There's so many stories to tell, and art in a big way is used. Our government loves to use the word social cohesion. I'm not such a fan of it, but I think it really is a way in which we can and I think it speaks to your skits, Tyson, in a way as well. You know, you're creating something which is satirical, where we can laugh at ourselves, but it's also rooted in some kind of reality. And I think art has that kind of power to make us think about things differently, to in some ways, I think, address past traumas and to build community. But I don't mean that in like the fake kumbaya, we live in this rainbow nation, you know, ideal, because that is the aspiration, but the reality is we don't. But the short of the long story is I'm hoping to find what solutions might be out there or what the future might look like.
I mean, it excites me and it scares me, especially being in the arts and hearing how people are being affected by all of this. I mean, we've tried our best because it's all about building an audience from this point forward. And I think that needs to be the focus for the rest of the time.
And also, we shouldn't forget that during lockdown, people have been consuming content made by artists, whether it's Spotify, Netflix, YouTube, and art does have a place in society. Like, imagine what your life would be like without art. And I'm not saying art in like a white walled gallery. I'm saying without your Netflix, without SABC 1, 2, or 3, without your soapies. So also getting people to think about arts in their everyday lives and how they consume it as well. It does form a big part of what we do, even if it's just entertainment.
I love that. I'm so ready for this article. Really ready.
No pressure.
No pressure. You know, just going to be putting it on blast and a countdown.
There we go.
But really, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to sit with me. I do realize that I have gone over time a bit, but thank you so much for sharing your insights with me and just being willing to talk about your journeys and inspire the next writer out there. That is the whole point behind these talks that we do, is to get people to be inspired to see the as a viable industry and to actually see the impact that it has and just how much of your life, like you're saying just now, is how much of your life is actually surrounded by art. And we don't think about it. We don't ever take a moment to go, oh, whoa, this article was really beautifully written by somebody who's spent a lot of their time actually reading and learning how to write to present the story to you. And we don't see that as something, we see it as, we take it for granted and see it as something that's supposed to be, but it really isn't. It is such a beautiful part of life. And I believe we need to just build the audience so we can have a stronger industry and more understanding around the world. For South Africa and for like every industry, really, every art industry. Yeah, so that was my little spiel for the moment. But thank you guys so much for joining me and willing to share with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Carl. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And that is us.